Review of an unread book continued by Stanislaw, translated from the German by the spirit of Hegel. It is generally believed that the charade staged immediately afterward by the guards, who led the victims to the supposed baths where they were killed with Zyklon B, was dictated purely by practical considerations. The announcement of a bath, which seemed quite natural to the newcomers, instilled hope, lulled their suspicions, prevented any acts of desperation, and even encouraged them to cooperate with the guards. Therefore they willingly obeyed the order to undress, which seemed perfectly logical in the staged situation. Accordingly, it would be solely due to this staging that the streams of people pouring out of the railway cars went naked to their deaths. This explanation seems so obvious that all the researchers who studied the genocide simply accepted it and didn't even try to find another reason for the victims' nakedness that went beyond the literalness of the orchestrated deception. Yet although Desart's fantasies were undisguised debauchery, and the Nazi genocide as an unindustrialized crime maintained an administrative puritanism toward the victims until the very last moment, they had to die naked in both cases, and this correspondence is by no means mere coincidence, as Pernicus argues. Is that not true? Why then did the poorest of the poor, even the Jewish paupers from the Galician towns, in their patched kaftans, or in the camp during the winter in paper cement sacks, rags, and tatters, why did they, too, have to take off their shabby clothes and stand naked before the execution ditch? The huddled crowd, standing naked and awaiting the rifle volleys, could no longer be deceived by the pretense of any hope. A completely different approach was taken with people who were captured as hostages or as partisans, with weapons in their hands. They sank into the ditch in their blood-soaked clothes. The Jews, however, had to step to the edge of the ditch naked. The assertion that the Germans, who were supposedly naturally thrifty, were concerned about the clothing is a deceitful, fabricated argument. They were by no means concerned about the clothing. It often piled up in warehouses in huge quantities, and rotted there. It got even stranger. Jews who were captured in battle, such as during the Warsaw Uprising, did not have to undress before being shot. In general, Jewish partisans were also allowed to die in their clothes during executions. Only the defenseless died naked, the elderly women, children, and the disabled. Naked, just as they had come into the world, they went into the clay pit. The murder was, in a sense, a surrogate for the dispensation of justice and love. The executioners, half father, half lover, stood before the mass of naked people preparing for death, and was supposed to give them a just death, just as the father gives just punishment, just as a lover, his eyes fixed on the naked body, caresses it. Is that even conceivable? Can one even see any connection of love here? Of whatever kind, perhaps a macabre parody of it? Isn't such an interpretation an irresponsible phantasmagoria? To understand why it nevertheless was this way, we must, says Aspernicus, after examining the ethics of evil, turn to the second caveat of National Socialism, to kitsch, otherwise we will miss the deepest, because ultimate meaning of the genocide. Aspernicus defines the term as follows: nothing that has been created for the first time can be kitsch. Kitsch is always an imitation of something that once radiated authenticity in culture, but which has been repeated and embellished so often that it has gone to the dogs. Kitsch is a later version, like the botched copy of a masterful painting, improved by thoughtless imitators who distort the colours and forms of the original by applying more and more paint and varnish, driven by an increasingly deteriorating taste for the gaudy, ostentatious, and pretentious. Kitsch generally represents the end of the road, a very carefully executed degradation, perfected in its details, a composition in a state of schematic hardening. A sketch, however, can fundamentally never be kitsch, for it offers the discerning eye the saving grace of an additional interpretation, something that self-assured kitsch never does. The so-called bad taste in kitsch is the unintentional ridiculousness of solemn seriousness, its symbolism inflated to the point of bursting. Kitsch appears as an inherent style of National Socialism in all its manifestations, as monumentalism in a state of rigid formality in architecture, the pantheons in a state of advanced pregnancy, the government buildings overwhelming the viewer with their enormous dimensions, with doors and windows built as if for giants, with sculptures presenting naked strongmen and naked goddesses on guard, for this Kish was primarily intended to compel humble admiration, if not fear and terror, and so it presented itself, albeit inwardly hollow, ostentatiously sublime. Here one could draw on models from Greece, Rome, or Haussmann's Paris, but in the sphere of genocide the style found it difficult to manifest itself. Otherwise, there were all sorts of respectable styles that only needed to be inflated in a great power manner. But where to find the models for the human slaughterhouse? Thus, the technical side of the massacre now came to the forefront, and the killing facilities were characterized by a rather primitive functionalism, simply because it wasn't worthwhile to invest greater resources in the technology, since it was largely replaced by the collaboration of the victims who, as long as they were alive, took charge of the transport, the searches, and the looting of the corpses themselves. Nevertheless, Kitsch had seeped into the camps and onto the assembly grounds because, although no one intended it, it crept into the dramaturgy of mass murder on an industrial scale. The Tsar, an aristocrat from an ancient lineage, didn't need to worry about a noble setting for his orgies. His high status was inherent, so according to his credo as a libertine, he unrestrainedly mocked and defiled the symbols of traditional superiority over the mob, in the unconscious conviction that nothing could deprive him of his high position. Even if the guillotine had claimed him, it would still have been Marquis Donatien Alphonse Francois de Sade who was beheaded, the son of a count, and a mother who came from a collateral line of the Bourbon royal family. The Hitler clique, on the other hand, consists of a gang of aristo ruffians, louts, sons of non-commissioned officers, bakers' apprentices, and third-rate scribblers who craved advancement, although their constant personal involvement in the slaughter seemed more likely to hinder such a rise. So what model could they emulate? How and what role could they play, standing knee-deep in entrails in this slaughterhouse, without losing sight of their lofty aspirations? The path most readily acceptable to them, that of Kitsch, led them very far all the way to God, naturally to the stern God the Father, and not to the tearful Jesus, the God of mercy and redemption, who sacrificed himself. How were people to appear before the last judgment? Naked. This was such a judgment. The valley of Jehoshaphat stretched out everywhere. Naked, they were to play the role of the condemned in a drama in which everything was mystified, the evidence of guilt and the justice of the judgment, except for the ending. But that lie was the truth, for they truly had to die, and since the murderers held their fate in his hands, he was at that very moment filled with both bloodlust and divine omnipotence. Of course, when one describes it like this, one immediately senses the repulsive, farcical nature of this mystery, which unfolded day after day in dozens of places in Europe for many years. Certainly, the dramaturgy underwent changes. It fluctuated here and there. The pre-execution ceremony was reduced to a laconic minimum. Truly, it was difficult to play the role of God the Father in this play, staged amidst the bleak scenery of barracks and barbed wire fences. It was difficult to slaughter millions and deliver speeches in the throngs to the throngs of victims, in spring, in summer, in autumn, for years on end. To play this role without significant cuts, without growing contempt, would have been too tedious and too dreary. The murderers, in their weariness, contented themselves with fragments of the plot, with excerpts from the Last Judgment, with dress rehearsals, but always with the same epilogue. The execution became progressively worse. The corpses refused to burn. Blood rose from the flattened mass graves. In the summer, the stench of burning bodies was even unpleasantly noticeable to the distant houses of the camp guards. But at least the killing itself was never botched. The chapter of the final solution as redemption concludes with the following words. I know that no one who was not involved in these events as either executioner or victim will believe me, and that my explanations will be dismissed as the product of an irresponsible imagination. All the more so since the victims are no longer alive, and although 40 years have passed since the massacre, no executioner's diary has surfaced, not even the anonymous account of the events. How is this absolute silence to be explained, which stands in such stark contrast to the natural human inclination to record the most intense memories of life, or at least the most extreme ones, which after all are not granted to everyone? Indeed, even confessions published under a pseudonym are lacking, so that literary apocrypha had to take their place. How can something like this be explained, other than by the actor's indifference to a role he has long since abandoned? Dear reader, we must agree that the actors were by no means conscious of their roles, and it would be absurd and foolish to assume that the henchmen understood what they were doing, that they consciously slipped into the roles of the righteous God who rightfully takes life. A monstrous kitsch is at play here, and the first characteristic and prerequisite of kitsch is that for those who create it, it does not represent kitsch at all, but rather what they, with full of subjective conviction, consider it to be: genuine painting, genuine sculpture, inspired architecture. Anyone who discovered signs of kitsch in their work would neither continue nor complete it. I am not saying something quite different, namely that people cannot act either individually or collectively, cannot take a single step or even greet one another without depending on a pattern, that is, without following a style or a model. Therefore, some kind of styles, some kind of pattern had to fill the unprecedented void of mass crime in the technological age, and so they filled it with those patterns that, having been absorbed in early childhood, were most familiar to everyone, namely with the patterns and symbols of Christianity, which they had indeed renounced by joining National Socialism, but this does not mean that they had erased all traces of it from their memory. Neither in the SS, nor in the SA, nor in the party apparatus were there any Muslims, Buddhists, or Taoists, and in the monstrous apostasy of the concentration camps there were certainly no devout Christians. Only bloody kitsch emerged there, because something had to fill the styleless void. This something was what was available to the henchmen as a kind of intellectual reflex, and this was because Mein Kampf, the myth of the 20th century, and the mountains of paper, indoctrination, the entire blood and soil literature, contained not a single word, no instruction whatsoever, no guidance that would have been suitable to fill the void with concrete content. Here the henchmen had been left to their own devices by their leaders, and thus the blasphemous kitsch came into being. In its dramaturgy it was, of course, a miserable simplification, as if taken from a school notebook, vague remains of memories from catechism lessons, which were unconsciously and thoughtlessly picked up, so that only fragments remained in the original all-righteousness, omnipotence, and not as concepts, but rather as crude illustrations. Further evidence, supporting my arguments, in this circumstantial case, is the fact that the occupying authorities were more concerned with nothing than making the murder appear as the just order of things. It is generally assumed, and today all scholars of National Socialism agree on this, that the Jews were the fixed idea of the Third Reich, with which Hitler has self-destructively infected his movement and consequently the German people, that it was therefore a persecution complex that escalated into aggression, a general social paranoia, since all evil was seen in the Jews, and for those who were undoubtedly not Jews and had no connection whatsoever with them, the term white Jews was invented, which, despite all its absurdities, was systematically used. However, as is evident from this, the essence of Judaism, contrary to all fundamental tenets of National Socialism, was not race, but evil, of which the Jews proved to be the highly concentrated particular embodiment. This made them the number one problem of the Reich, the personal obsession of National Socialism, and their liquidation became a historical necessity which was accordingly carried out. Pogroms played the main role in the traditional persecution of Jews, but the Germans almost never resorted to them. They did so immediately after seizing power, when it seemed necessary to take to the streets, to sweep along the undecided and give the determined the chance to prove themselves. But the strengthened National Socialism victorious in war, very rarely incited pogroms. They usually occurred when the defeated armies retreated and the German advance units entered the abandoned cities. But even that was not the rule. As one might assume, they restrained themselves and others from participating in pogroms because these were bloody riots, closely associated with looting and destruction of Jewish property, and thus with ordinary crimes, while the persecution of the Jews was not supposed to be a criminal offence, but its diametrical opposite, namely the meting out of supreme justice. The Jews were to receive what was due to them according to law and justice. This commentary explains the Germans' aversion to the pogroms, their reluctance on this point, but it does not explain why the Germans, who were happy to deploy prisoners and deserters recruited from among the Russian partisans, such as the Vlasov men or the SS units organized throughout Europe, consisting of Nordic volunteers from Spain, France, and Holland, why they never used non-Germans for the liquidation of the Jews, with the exception of cases where, for example, no Germans were available on the spot. In these exceptional cases, it can be proven in each individual instance, based on surviving documents, that the decision to use non-Germans in an extermination action arose from a situation of necessity. From this, it is clearly evident to what extent it became a personal matter for the Germans to settle accounts with the Jews. No one was allowed to do it for them. By proxy, the deportation of the Jews to the labor camps was, so to speak, only the prelude to their final extermination. The extermination camps were created only later and exclusively for the Jews. As is well known, the intentions underlying any action can be read more clearly from the factual evidence than from explanations or declarations that preceded the facts or commented on them retrospectively. If one examines the facts independently of the entire Hitler doctrine and the verbal efforts of Goebbels and his press, it becomes irrefutably clear that the decision regarding the final solution of the Jewish question, in its deadly form, had already been made before the war fronts began to collapse. Therefore, the haste with which the extermination of the Jews was carried out cannot be explained by the desire to commit the murder before anyone could help the victims. This means that even in the perpetrator's own understanding, the genocide went beyond the categories of revenge and retaliation that they themselves proclaimed, because it was more than that, it was their historical mission. What did this mission ultimately signify? Never explicitly named, it forms a nebulous backdrop through which the Judeo-Christian symbolism, inverted into murder, shines through the technology and sociography of genocide. It was as if the Germans, unable to kill God, killed his chosen people in order to take their place and, after the bloody dethronement in effigy, become self-proclaimed chosen people of history. The sacred symbols were not erased but turned upside down. The anti-Semitism of the Third Reich was therefore, at its deepest level, merely a pretext. The ideologues were not audacious enough to literally attempt the killing of God, but the negation of God through word and law was not enough for them. The churches could be suppressed, but they could not be completely destroyed. It was too early for that. But they had a people at hand who had given birth to Christianity, and to exterminate this people meant to approach an attack on God through the execution sites as closely as human power could possibly manage. The murder was an act of anti-redemption. Through it, the Germans freed themselves from the biblical covenant. But this liberation was meant to be total, meaning it could not be synonymous with a transition from God's protection to the protection of the opposing side. The murder was not intended as an act of homage to satanic evil, but rather as a rebellion crowned by the attainment of total independence from both the dark and the radiant heavens. And although no one in the entire empire ever expressed it in these terms, the unspoken understanding of the earthly nature of these things was secretly common knowledge among the murderous conspirators. The hatred for the victims had its counterpart in an attachment to them. A high-ranking SS officer expressed this when standing at the window of a saloon car traveling through the sandy landscape of his district, sparsely covered with pine trees. He said to his traveling companion, "Here lie my Jews." The death he had brought upon them connected them to him. The lower-ranking officers sometimes found it difficult to understand why children had to die with their mothers. To correct the fatal lack of guilt, they improvised the creation of guilt. When some of the recently arrived mothers tried to deny their own children because only childless women were assigned to work, mothers with children were immediately sent to the crematoria. Such unnatural mothers were punished on the spot for denying their motherhood. The fact that the children for whom the executioner had intervened were also immediately killed did not disturb the comedy of righteous indignation in the least. Let no one say that among the murderers, aflame with righteous anger, there were readers of the Marquis de Sade who had conceived analogous comedies involving the symbolic murder of God 150 years earlier, and that the SS men were plagiarizing him by intervening on behalf of the children whose skulls they would shatter only moments later. They provided in this farce of justice, so clumsily cobbled together that it immediately fell apart, a clue that they were unconsciously remaining true to the never-spoken truth according to which the genocide was to be considered a vicarious execution of God.